Welcome, Victoria, and again, thanks for taking the time to have a chat with us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so should we just jump in?
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay, so we all follow you on Instagram, and we know that like you seem to be juggling a lot of different projects at once, and it's incredibly impressive, honestly. So does it ever happen that you sit down to work on one book or one project and then you just have to switch to another because inspiration strikes? Or
it's tempting, but here's the thing is like you'll hear a lot of writers talk about the shiny new idea, and essentially what happens is a lot of writers and a lot of upcoming writers, like ones who are aspiring, they struggle to finish a book. And the reason so many people struggle to finish a book is because you get about 50 to 100 pages in and suddenly you get a shiny new idea and you want to follow it. And I think that I've learned over time not to give in to that temptation. When I have a desire to work on a different project, I might open a file and make some notes in it, but I don't let myself ever fully pivot from one project to another because I know it's a trap. Because the reason that your brain does that shiny new idea, it's because the act of writing a story is the act of becoming familiar with it. Like you're getting to know it, it's less mysterious, it's less desirable because it's got answers. And so what happens is the more comfortable you become with the story you're telling, the more you want to switch focus to something else. But it's really just an avoidance tactic. And so I've learned well enough at this point. But sure, I mean, I have days where I wake up and I want to work on the next Vicious book. I want to work on something else. And so what I do is my mornings are really dedicated to whatever I'm working on right now. And then if I have any leftover energy in the evenings and I just can't get that out of my system, I'll open a scene of Victor Vale and play with it and just like drop some enough notes into it that I can kind of shake the urge off. But yeah, about once a week, I make a really big list that's like, I call it my all the windows open in my head list. And it's essentially just a way for me to take everything I'm working on, everything that's, living rent free in my brain, everything consuming my attention, and put it on a piece of paper so that I can see it instead of think about it.
Yeah.
And it's one of the only ways that I stay even remotely on top of things, I would say.
That's fair enough. Time management is hard.
Yeah. Time management is really hard. And I'm not a very fast writer. Like people don't believe me. I'm a very consistent worker. I'm a very, what I call a relentless creative, but I'm not someone like my friend Kirsten White is writing a whole book this week. Like she will sit down, she plans for a couple months, and then she will sit down and write 5,000 to 10,000 words a day. If I try to do that, I know I'm 21 books in now at this point. If nothing else, I know myself. I'll do it for 2 days and then I won't work for 2 weeks because I'll just be really burned out. So I do what works for me. And that's this kind of like tortoise style, slow, methodical work each day.
Well, it's definitely working for you because honestly, the amount of stuff you published.
Well, and stuff that doesn't even get counted. Like I spent 6 months of the last year in a writer's room for a TV show, and but I still had book deadlines, and it was actually my writer's room for my upcoming Netflix show was happening as Addie LaRue hit shelves in the United States.
Oh, wow.
So, and I was living in France, and so I would do book work on Gallant, my next novel, all day. And then my writer's room would start at 6:30 p.m. my time. And I would have to leave the writer's room for an hour and a half around 10, 11 p.m. to do an event for Addie, and then come back and finish the writer's room around 2 a.m.
Oh my God.
And it was like, I can never do that again. I'm too old now. Like that took years off my life. But no, I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And so I try and just almost do like some tunnel vision when I sit down to actually work. I never sit down and think I'm writing a book or I'm writing a chapter or I'm just writing words.
What do you struggle with the most when it comes to writing?
Self-doubt. I feel like anyone who follows me at all online knows that answer. I am my worst enemy. And it's hard, actually. I think that's the wrong phrasing, because my self-doubt pushes me to make every book better and to take risks that I might not take and to challenge myself in ways that I might not if I didn't have this little demon sitting on my shoulder telling me to do better. But I do feel like I fight an entire battle every time I sit down to work. Like I have to go through this gauntlet with my own mental landscape, you know? And I mentioned online the other day that like I seem to forget my own process. I just forget it every single time. So everyone who follows me is privy to watching this kind of short-term memory loss. And someone pointed out to me, a psychiatrist pointed out to me online that that's like a trauma response. Like we tend to forget things that are highly traumatic. So apparently my relationship to creativity is traumatic enough that I'm like blocking out massive parts of it. No, I'd say that my biggest struggle like is just my own fears of inadequacy, of not being up to the task that I have set for myself. And the best part is it will screw you over in success and in failure. So when I have something that I feel doesn't perform, it's like builds that voice. And when I have something that does perform, it validates that voice. Because it's like when Addie came out and Addie became so big, the voice in my head was then, everything you do from now on will be a disappointment, or people will always say, or her last book was better, or people will only want you to write this kind of story, even though out of my 20 books it's like the weird one, it's not the norm. And so I think you have to be careful, because there's a way in which you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't in that mental scape.
Absolutely.
What endings do you prefer, either to read or to write? Eddie has a fairly open ending, and I know you got many questions about sequels.
So my favorite endings to write, I like all kinds of stories when I'm reading, but my favorite endings to write are the ones that make you believe that the characters' lives go on past the last page of the book. So I think that I like giving sometimes a measure of closure, but I want you to close that book and not feel as if their story ended. And that's different from saying like, I needed more to feel satisfied. A good book, a good standalone, leaves you wanting more, but not needing more. And I think like, Shades of Magic, for instance, is another one of my series, and I'm like working on the next book of it now. And like, I ended Conjuring of Light, but I ended it in a way that I hope when you pick up Threads of Power, you understood that like these characters kept living. They lived for 7 years between these two books. And so I think I try to write characters who feel real enough that when you set the story down, their story continues. You're just no longer privy to it.
Yeah, I think that's the best kind of ending, honestly. Absolutely.
It's like The Window. It's like I try to write books that feel like windows into someone else's house, and then the window closes. Like the house is still there, the people are still inside, you just can't see it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you managed to do that even in between books. Like, for example, with the Shades of Magic trilogy, I totally had that feeling between like the first and the second, for example.
It's like 4 months, and I feel like a lot happens in those 4 months.
Oh, yeah.
Lila becomes like a serious sailor.
Absolutely. And I think that contributed to how much I love the second book. I think that's my favorite book out of the trilogy, because you just see those characters come so far that like they're not the people that they were when we closed down the first story, and it's just fascinating to watch.
Yeah. I do love an ending. I mean, maybe it's just the generation we live in now where like every movie has a coda, but I do love an ending that like is a little cheeky in terms of like letting you think like that there's something there. I feel like Gallant, my next book, has a little bit of that, where it feels like it's a fairy tale, and so I want it to have a sense of closure, but at the same time, like I don't want you to let your breath out. I don't want you to feel entirely safe in your closure.
Yeah.
It's almost like my favorite thing. And this is the thing, you either love this or you hate this, but I will think about it to this day, is the end shot of Inception.
Mm-hmm.
Which has
Yeah.
like the little spinny wheel, and like the fact that it starts to topple and it cuts to black, like that's how I want that feeling of like you think something is resolved and you're just left with doubt. Because I think that's why I write fantasy. Why I write fantasy that hugs close to reality specifically is because like my great goal is to instill doubt in your perception of reality. I want to make you question your reality and like question the world in which you live and whether it's stranger or wilder or more magical. And I feel like that desire for doubt extends to like the end of a book, where I kind of want you to have to wonder about some element, big or small, about how the story ends.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've sort of gone about this backwards because we started talking about endings, but let's talk about beginnings a little. So
all right.
We know that you carried Eddie's story with you for a very long time. I believe it was 10 years.
Yes.
And we've been wondering that what was your first memory of her, or the first scene or fragment that came to you?
That's such a good question, because it is a book of fragments in many ways. And it's interesting. And there's video footage of it online. I was hiking. So it was 2011, and I was hiking through the Lake District by myself. And I was beginning to mull over this idea of writing some kind of inverse Peter Pan. That was like the very first thing I was thinking of. And I was climbing a very steep hill, and I got to the top and I was so exhausted that I just had to sit down for a little bit. I'm like, can't see a person from any direction, can't see civilization, can't see anything. And I just remember, this is just indicative of how I think as a person. I remember sitting there entirely by myself, so bone weary from this climb, and just thinking, I bet this is what it feels like to live forever. Because there was like, I was just tired. Like there was this sense of fatigue. At the same time, I was surrounded by this incredible vista and I was in awe of it. And it wasn't like I didn't want to be there. But I was thinking a lot about how in immortality tales, there's always this like existential ennui that immortals have because they've lived so long. And it was a really interesting contrast, because I felt that in that moment, this like sense of like wanting to lie down and rest. But I also felt this incredible sense of wonder at the world around me, this like mist-laden expanse of sky and mountain. And those two kind of competing principles really created Addie, right? Like this sense of exhaustion and weariness, but also this sense of, I'm so glad I didn't stop one day sooner because I would have missed this view.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about in terms of gifts and curses, but which one is it and which one is it more in any given moment. And it's
I mean, that's the thing, right? Like to your point exactly, I think it is depending on the day, right? Like there are days when things feel like blessings and things when they don't. And I feel like Addie, you know, she's defined by stubborn hope and defiant joy. And in a lot of ways, she's a counterpoint to Henry's depression, because it's this concept of like having to remind yourself there is always something worth living for, even if it's small and even if you haven't experienced it yet. Like Addie propels herself through her darkest moments by the understanding that there will be something that she sees perhaps tomorrow or the next day or years from now where she will be glad that she made it there.
Yeah. I remember this scene from the book when she told Luke about seeing an elephant.
Yeah, an elephant in Paris. And like that became this weird little, you know, sometimes you write a line and you just know it's going to be something sticky like that. Like I remember writing Lila Bard's I'd rather die on an adventure than live standing still, and just being like, oh, or like in Conjuring of Light, my favorite passage is love and loss are like a ship in the sea. Like it's this sense of like with one rises, so does the other. And I remember, it's such a strange line to remember, but I remember that line and being like, I saw an elephant in Paris becoming a kind of shorthand for I saw something wonderful and you can't take that away from me. Like you're trying to wear me down. You're trying to make me give up. And you have no idea that I will hold on to like the very promise of wonder in this world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where the magic is for Eddie and for the reader who goes on this journey with her, because her curse is very simple on the surface, but then she starts pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
And I wonder, was it difficult to decide where the boundaries are? Have you ever struggled with it?
Yes. I mean, that probably was a couple years of work trying to figure out exactly how I wanted her curse to behave. Because, and it's a little cheeky because, like, obviously Luke is playing with her. And so I could allow for a tiny bit of flex based on how he's playing. And you can ask yourself, like, is he doing it to torture her or is he doing it to give her opportunities to push back? It really kind of depends. There's very few right answers when it comes to Luke. It really is about, like, your reader, whether they believe in his authenticity. Like, do you believe that he loves her? Do you believe that he's doing anything out of kindness? Do you believe that the moment he takes her out of Paris and into Italy to get her away from the war, is that a kindness, or is he stranding her somewhere else? Again, like, you have to ask yourself these questions. But yeah, I like spent so long trying to figure out where did I want the push and pull of the curse to be, and what would give me the best, like, playfulness. And it was interesting because a lot of the decisions I had to make were less about the curse and more about Addie. So for instance, I very early on had to decide to make her extremely feminine, because there's a version of this story wherein she can pass for male. And then she spends 300 years, or at least 250 of them, in men's attire, passing as male and avoiding and circumnavigating a lot of the restrictions that would be on her autonomy as a woman. And I didn't want to give her that out. I was like, we are not allowing you to cross-dress. We are not allowing that, because it would have created a different narrative in which she would have been more liberated, but only because she presented as masculine. And I didn't want that for her. I wanted her to learn how to move through the world as herself. And my characters do tend to sway, like, more towards the androgyny. And so I was like, no, that's why I made it so that she could only pass at night and from a distance. And even then it kind of doesn't work. But the art aspect of the curse was probably my favorite one to figure out, like, because that really becomes the entire heart of the story, doesn't it? Like, what is inspiration? What is art? And I mean, the thing is, Addie is the work of so many years that I can track the inspiration for every little piece. One of my best friends in this world is a photographer. And probably 7-8 years ago, I remember having a very intense conversation with her. She's a professor as well of photography, about how photography is a lie. Like, how we take it to be veracity, we take it to be truth, when really everything about a photograph is a composure and an erasure, an exclusion. And so that whole concept of what is truth and, like, what is interpretation and what is the lens and what is the viewer goes on to inspire everything from Addie's curse and her ability to inspire people and be amused, to Henry's fascination with the lie of photography. Like, all of it is inextricably connected to, like, conversations I had with friends a decade ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's amazing to see that and to talk to you about it, because, there's so much we would never know otherwise.
No. So many little pieces. I mean, I had a document. I kept a Scrivener file for almost a decade, for the last 5 years anyway. And for so many years, in order to get into Luke's character, I was convinced that every time he saw her after being away, he would recite a piece of poetry about love or about attachment, about something like that. And the poetry would change over the centuries to reflect what was around him. And I ended up not using it, of course. It's very on the nose, but it still became such an underpinning of his romanticism and of his character, to the point where I had tacked on a piece of paper over my desk the "Come away with me and be my love," which is a very famous line of poetry, because it so summed up Luke. It's not a question, it's an order, it's a command. Come away with me and be my love is like this thing I always imagine him saying to her. We never see it, but it doesn't change the fact that I held on to it as, like, the creator the entire time I was building them.
Yeah. And Eddie and Luke's relationship dynamic it just keeps us guessing. And I kept wondering while reading the book, is that how much of it is really just forced proximity? Because Eddie's curse is special, so Luke gets to spend so much time with her, and vice versa, that I was wondering, like, Is it chemistry or is it just them holding on to each other when there's nothing else?
I mean, I'm not going to answer that because I truly, like, I obviously have my belief in terms of what their relationship is and isn't. Obviously, it's a completely skewed power dynamic, and it is a very, very unhealthy relationship.
For sure.
But to your point, like, they are all each other has for so long that we can't blame Addie for having an intimacy that is born out of familiarity. I mean, it's gaslighting over 300 years. So to me, the question really is, and again, I'm not going to provide an answer, but the question is, it really comes down to whether the reader believes that as Luke changes Addie, Addie also changes Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as Luke draws Addie out of humanity and makes, because he says that by the present day, like, you haven't been human in a very, very long time, which is true. And Addie has never lived really a human life. For the vast, vast majority, she did for the first 23 years or whatever, but for the vast majority, she has not lived a comparable humanity. She is not human either. And so you really have to ask yourself whether what they have is real, and whether the way in which they got there invalidates what they have. So, like, should it not be real because it was a terrible way to go about where they got there? Like, does that mean it can never be real? Or does that simply mean we shouldn't reward it? I'm not going to answer it because, like I say, I have like a very strong opinion about it, but I love that readers disagree really vehemently over whether, because that's really the thing is, like, romance and entanglement, it's not simple. And I would argue that, like, there's no romance in this book. Like, there is Addie and Henry, and it's about intimacy. And there's Addie and Luke, and it's about obsession. Like, there is lust and there is intimacy. But I don't think you can call either one just a romance, because I don't think that, like, the parameters of any of those three leads allow for a simple, healthy, non-codependent, because you could ask the same questions about Henry. No one ever asked the question, but, like, you could ask the question about Henry.
Would be my
like,
next question.
Is it a valid relationship? Like, would they ever have come together? Would they ever have been a couple if everyone could remember her? Like, would they ever have been an actual couple? Because I think there is an argument, I'm not saying it's my argument, but I'm saying that there's an argument to be made that what Addie feels for Henry is an extreme amount of fondness, but she is getting something out of this. And, like, she has lived for 323 years at this point, and Henry has lived for 29. So the fact is, like, he is a flourish in her story, and she is the sum total of his love. It's not an equal relationship either, but they both get something deeply important out of it. So I think my main hesitation in this, rather than defining anything, is I simply don't think that either one of those entanglements should be reduced to romance.
I totally agree. And that would have been indeed my next question, is that Henry is also brought into this by the curse. And that's how they meet, and that's how they're able to form this special bond. So yeah, one could argue.
You have to ask. You could go down, like, you can go down an entire rabbit hole, and I have many times while writing it. But, like, you know, if Luke didn't choose Henry because he chose Henry because it looks like him, right? If Luke didn't choose Henry to play that game, Henry probably wouldn't have survived that night. Yeah. So, like, Henry's existence in the narrative is only because of Addie. Like, his story doesn't potentially continue. So it's like you have to weigh the scales. And I think what it really comes down to is, like, a desire to look at relationships with a much broader pen. It's the reason that I almost never write romance. It's not because I don't love romantic entanglement. Like, I will ship my characters till the cows come home. But it's because I think sometimes when we put romance into a story, somehow all of the other relationships get downgraded. Suddenly the presence of romance becomes the most important aspect, regardless of other relationships. And there are so many good relationships. There's, like, antagonists. There's there's friends, there's enemies, there's siblings, there's parent-child, there's allies. Like there's so many cool relationships that get undermined by the presence of kissing. Like, oh, well, they're a couple, so they must be the most important relationship. And so I think it's like really just me also pushing against the concept of like that romance shouldn't be simple. Like that, okay, so yeah, sure, you can call this book a love triangle. It would be wrong, but like you can call the book a love triangle, but I don't think you could call it a very simple one.
No. So yeah, like one could argue that the relationship Victor and Eli have is much more intense than any romance I've ever read.
Oh yeah. To the point where people obviously like cast an erotic, blanket over it. And of course I'm like very happy. People are always like, does that make you mad? I'm like, nothing makes me mad. Like when the book comes out, it doesn't belong to me anymore. Right. And if I've written something like the way I feel about it is that authors will only ever bring half of the story. The reader brings the other half. So like I can predict what I put on paper. I can never predict what anyone else brings to it. And the thing is, like, people conflate obsession with eroticism. Like Victor and Eli are unquestionably obsessed with one another.
Oh yeah.
And I think one of the way we only really know how to contextualize obsession through sex, but that's not the only way to contextualize obsession. First of all, Victor is asexual. Second of all, Eli is absolutely fluid, but like, I don't think he was ever like in love with Victor. I think he's obsessed with Victor.
Mm.
So I think that there's definitely like compulsion there. And I love that. They're my favorite, relationship of all of my books. All of my favorite relationships are antagonism, but like Kel and Alucard are one of my favorite relationships.
Oh,
like I wrote the moment today in threads when like it's their first interaction in the book. So it's the first time I've written them since Conjuring of Light, where they're actually talking to each other. And immediately I was just like, I love you guys. You're such assholes. Like they just hate each other. So I think antagonism interests me in general far more than attraction.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that I'm like vibrating because I cannot wait for Threads of Power.
My God, there's so much like there, because it's basically the first like 50,000 words is like Kel, Lila, Ryan, Alucard. So I really should probably write some of my new characters at some point.
Oh, that sounds like a dream. And just turning this a little back to Eddie. So what inspired you to create the gods? Because I found it such a peculiar and honestly just beautiful kind of component of Luke's. He's the god of night and also possibilities, and it's just so good together. And I just wonder how you came up with that.
So I'm pagan, so I already like believe in a multiplicity of gods, right? And all through college I studied polytheism, these god systems where we don't have one god, we have multiples. And the thing that's really exciting about dealing with a pantheon of gods instead of a monotheism is like, in all monotheistic religions, God has to be infallible. That's like the great paradox, right? Like God cannot be flawed because God is all powerful. Really exciting thing happens when you take the one God and you like break it down into multiple avatars, is that they get to be flawed. You see this with the Vikings, you see like the Norse gods, you see this with Greco-Roman pantheons. Like suddenly these gods, what I call them, the gods with the lowercase g. There's like God with the uppercase G, and that's the mono. And then we've got like gods. And when you have a pantheon, they're so messed up because they much closer resemble the people that worship them. So suddenly you have arrogant gods and petty gods and jealous gods and covetous gods and lustful gods. And like, that to me is much more exciting as a creator, as a writer. And so very early on in writing Luke, I realized that he is a predecessor to a Christian devil, right? So he obviously predates, as paganism predates Christianity. He is an older god. He's a god who has been adapted. And that's something that, for instance, with the Norse gods and the Vikings, like happened. They would essentially, like, in order to infiltrate polytheistic religion, they would make like Jesus one of the gods. They would be like, hey, we have a god. Can he join your gods? We're not going to erase your gods. We just want to let this one join you. And then they would let like Jesus join the Norse pantheon, and then they would slowly erase every other part of the pantheon so that only Jesus was there, right? So I was really interested in this idea of something predating Christianity. It's just like something that interests me. And also what it really meant was that instead of this kind of amorphous Hades figure, I could have this petty, petulant child of a god. Because that's essentially what it is. I was like, I don't want this, like, to me, this is not Christian Grey, right? Like, what I want is a god who's just like a jealous dick. He's your ex-boyfriend. Like, that's what Luke is supposed to be. He's like your jealous ex-boyfriend. He's a toddler. Like, he's never used to hearing no. He doesn't appreciate it. And that level of petulance made him far more interesting to me than like this smoke and mirrors seductor. Because I think you can have both. And so I knew from very early on, like, that I wanted Luke to abide by the old God rules. Also because while I will never write a sequel to Addie LaRue, it's a standalone novel. Something that does really interest me is what the rest of Luke's pantheon looks like. Because obviously he belongs to a pantheon, means there are several other gods, including one who is his counterpart. You know, and so I'm like really curious. And I spent about 6 months after I finished Addie just starting to like sketch out some of the other gods in this pantheon that I've made.
So does this mean that we get to meet those gods at any point?
Maybe. I am committing to nothing right now. I'm working on Threads of Power. Every time I commit to something, people get like angry that it's not out immediately. And like, I am, as we've established, not a fast writer.
Fair enough. Plausible deniability. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, the story takes place over 300 years, as you mentioned. So, and it's made up of fragments. How did you pick those fragments, those like times and moments and places and people to appear in the book? Because it's such a long time.
Many things did not make it in the book. One of the luxuries of working on like gestating Addie LaRue over the course of 10 years is that I got the initial idea for it before my first novel was published, and I wrote it after 19 books. And so what that means is like I was on tour for a large portion of the time I was working on Addie, traveling to different countries and cities. And so I had this passenger. So this entire time I'm traveling, anytime I would go somewhere, I would ask myself, how would Addie engage with this place? What would she see? What would she do? If I could only spend a paragraph here, what would I do? Because I knew that the flashbacks were going to be brief in order for this book not to be like 1,000 pages long. It was really hard to pick what went in and what didn't. And sometimes I would take an idea I had for one place and give it to another place because of where she was. Not to get too technical, but I essentially broke her story down into 3 centuries to form like the 3 acts of her identity. Right? The beginning act, that first 100 years, is really her learning the terms of her curse. The second 100 years is her manipulating that curse. And the third 100 years is her basically embracing this life. And then I laid over that her shifting relationship with Luke. And so her relationship with Luke in first 100 years is just antagonism. Second 100 years is complication. Third 100 years is entanglement. And so I wanted to trace that. And then over the top of that, I had to lay geography, and I had to pick a path for her. I needed some form of tether to keep it from becoming a travelogue. And so I essentially thought, okay, well, you know, she can't, even when planes become a thing, she can't really fly because there's no identity. Like, she can only stow away on things. So that limited her physical travel. And she's also a woman alone. So I tried to, and also we have to remember that when Addie does her deal, she's not doing the deal because she wants to travel the world. She literally just wants some time. She is somebody who is extremely hedonistic and drawn to creature comforts, especially once she doesn't have any. And so I really had her kind of target places of art and culture and opulence, places where she could thrive, or at least like get by with some semblance, because she can only steal and kind of like scrounge. She can't really hold on to anything. And so she's not looking to make life any harder than it already is. And so I essentially figured out that, you know, those first 100 years, she doesn't leave France. when Luke casts her out into Italy during the revolution. That's the first time she's ever been outside the country, which is why you have to start asking, like, is he aiding her in any way? It's not always an inhibit, like it's not always inhibiting her. So anyway, that first 100 years is France, and then it cracks the seal on Europe, and then it cracks the seal on America. And so those are kind of the way in which I formed the rough shape of her journey.
And could you tell us about the works of art that are scattered throughout the book? We touched on this a little bit,
Yeah.
but obviously some of it is real and some of it isn't. And how did you go about selecting those pieces?
You mean the pieces for the parts?
The pieces for the parts, and also just like, I found like some like Easter eggs just scattered throughout that I was like, is it referring to that? But then I wasn't sure because it wasn't named. So I was just wondering what was the process behind it.
So all of the works of art in the book are fiction, designed to like emulate reality, right? So every now and then, I played more with setting in this way, but every now and then you encounter something real. And I heard Taylor Jenkins Reid put this perfectly. I did an event with her a few weeks ago, and she said the trick to writing believable historical is to make up everything and then put your character next to somebody real, because even a passing glance at reality starts to validate everything that you experience. So like the Frank Sinatra scene or Beethoven, like this sense of just like a passing cursory glance. For instance, when she's in New York, half of the places she goes in New York City are entirely fictional, but half of them are real. And you should never be able to tell which is which. And I wanted the same feeling with art because, you know, she moves through artistic movements. And so while the exact artist that she encounters might be a fictional artist, the fact is she's still influencing various movements of art. And I wanted to give her that. I wanted to make sure that she felt contextual, that she felt like she could be real, like these people that she's encountering could be real. And so I was very, very careful only to sprinkle in a few real figures and then create fictional characters to stand right next to him. So like Remy. Remy is obviously not a historical character, but he engages with the Paris salon scene and engages with historical figures in the Paris salon scene. So that way, instead of having Addie have a love interest who was a historical figure in the Paris salon scene, I gave her a love interest who was next to the historical figures in the Paris salon scene.
Yeah, that's a very clever way to go about it. I got tricked a couple of times because obviously I've never been to New York, so I was like,
yeah,
does it exist? It would be so cool if it existed.
So the laundromat, which is the arcade that's hidden behind the laundromat, 100% real. Like very much a real place in New York City. The French restaurant that they go to, very much real. The little yellow bakery that the Frenchman is working in, inspired by a real place, but like the underground club, not real. The like things like that. The High Line, which is where the like massive art exhibit that they engage with, the High Line is completely real, and there are art exhibits there, but this particular art exhibit obviously never existed. So stuff like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
And now that we've talked about art, let's talk about names, because I love the name Addie LaRue. It's so beautiful and it fits her so perfectly. And we know that LaRue means road. So was this deliberate? And how do you go about naming characters in general?
This is the part that's hard for me to answer because I don't have a good answer. She was always Addie LaRue. Like sometimes character like Kel was always Kel. Addie LaRue was always Addie LaRue. But then sometimes like the main character in my next book, Gallant, took like 7 months of just like trying out random names like hats until I found the one. And I also can't write the book until I know the character's name. I can't give them a placeholder name. The way I liken it is that when I was born, I had no name for 3 weeks because my parents had 2 names that they had picked out, but they wanted to live with me to figure out which one best suited me as a child. And like, I do the exact same thing with my characters where I kind of like get to know them a bit and then try to find names that somehow fit what I'm learning of their personality. But it's like very much the only part of my process that's a little bit wishy-washy. Sometimes a character comes with a name and sometimes I'm just like playing with syllables until I find the cadence or rhythm that says something that I want.
That's fair enough. Let the creative genius work. Uh,
It's so bad because I'm usually like a very methodical person, and it drives me absolutely crazy that like Samantha Shannon has like deep historical processes and linguistic resources for finding her names, and I'm like, it sounds nice. I'm so bad about it.
if it works, right?
Yeah.
But just names in general. They seem to be quite short most of the time, so that's why Eddie in particular stood out to me, because it's such a lyrical name.
Yeah. And I don't, like I say, I don't know why. It just, the story was always The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. In fact, for the first year or so, it was like The Blank Life of Addie LaRue. I couldn't figure out what word I wanted there, but it was always The Something Life of Addie LaRue. I just liked the way it sounded. It just had a rhythm. And that's really like my rule with names, is like, I have to like the way they sound because I'm going to use them a lot. And I tend to really like shorter names. So if I give a character a longer name, I will also give them a nickname that I can use for them, because I'm just like one of those readers who, I like short and sweet. I will always look to do I have a way to shorten this name to like one syllable? Can I come up with a nickname that's one syllable? Like, I just don't like long names. My name is Victoria Elizabeth, so I'm not trying to give anyone else a long name here.
Oh, the deal with the devil, right? This is a quite historical literary trope that exists throughout literature and music and film. Do you have a favorite book or deal or even such a devil in literature? Not that they were portrayed or inspired, but
Yeah.
in general.
I mean, it's interesting because like my favorite deals with the devil are a little bit more metaphorical. Like, I tend to love vampires, and I feel like the vampire immortal cusp right there. So like my biggest jam growing up was Interview with a Vampire. And like Interview with a Vampire always deals with like two kinds of people in that story: the person who is already set in their immortality and the person who is now new to immortality. And I just like the contrast between characters like Louis and Lestat. Like, how can you see, which one of them is self-loathing, which one is hedonistic, which one, like, I love the counterpoint. Obviously, like I read a lot of Faust, and I love Paradise Lost. But I really just I like any story where someone is thrust into immortality, usually because it's harder to kill them. Well, it's impossible to kill them. And that means it comes with this level of recklessness. And I think that as a writer and as a viewer and a reader is like a deeply fun thing to play with. Like, because does immortality mean the absence of suffering? Does it mean instant healing? Does it mean you never age? It's very Dorian Gray. Like, there's just so much to play with. And I think as a rule maker and a world builder, like, you get to redefine what immortality is. Like, for instance, Raimaresh is technically immortal in Shades of Magic.
Yeah.
But it means something very different. He's only immortal as long as Kel is alive, and he's aging, and he heals almost instantly, but he still suffers and feels pain. Like, I love that there's not one version of immortality to play with there. Like, there's invulnerability, there's healing, there's all these kinds of things which allow for just like deeply interesting humanity exploration. Because I think that's the thing. We have this idea that like you become immortal and so you cease to be human. You become immortal and so you cease to become mortal, but that doesn't mean you cease to become human. And so it's a really interesting way to almost stress test a person's humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, okay. So we've gotten really deep. Let's go a bit more shallow. Have you seen, I'm sure you've seen the gorgeous international covers of Addie. They're beautiful. I wonder if you had a favorite.
I don't play favorites. What I love are the covers that are different. Like, so obviously, like, they're like the Spanish cover and the Brazilian cover are just adaptations of the American cover. That's beautiful. But then you look at like the Russian cover or the Hungarian cover or the French cover, and like the French cover, I know the illustrations that you guys have inside make me so deeply happy, like, as well. And so I'm actually waiting for my copy of this to come because I don't have a copy in person yet. But the French edition has a ghost cover. So it has like the title and it blurs Addie's face, and then you can take the cover off and it's like a portrait, which I love. The Russian cover is like black with gold stars that are tracing out the identity. You obviously have the Hungarian cover, which is exquisite. Then there's the Dutch cover, which is like a golden bird. And then underneath a constellation of a cat. Like there's just gorgeous little details. I just feel incredibly lucky because to me, every time I get a new cover, it's a new piece of artwork, right? And then you think about it like from a deep perspective of like what it means for Addie's story to be perpetuated out like that in multiple languages, in multiple, like because of that final scene where she's standing in front of the wall of books with her name just printed on it over and over again. It makes this very meta enjoyment that I feel whenever I see these covers, because I just think, oh, they can't forget you now. Like you just are making yourself immortal. And I think that's something we explore a lot as authors. We think about it, even if we don't admit that we think about it, like, how do we leave a lasting mark? Will our work outlive us? Things like that. And so it's kind of all part and parcel, isn't it?
Indeed. And we're so happy that you like the Hungarian cover.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it. And the artwork, my favorite piece of the artwork is actually the one with Henry sitting on the steps, the man who stayed dry in the rain.
We're so happy that you love it. I mean, I had nothing to do with it. Don't get me wrong.
we can all just I didn't have anything to do with it either, so we can just totally celebrate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then we kind of exhausted the Addie questions.
No.
All the questions that I have are like highly spoilery, so I'm not gonna ask it here.
Yeah.
But just in general, you write so many different kinds of stuff within the fantasy, science fiction, speculative genre.
Yeah.
And like, have you ever found yourself feeling limited because you've had success with one thing and then you were afraid to jump into another or anything like that?
Yeah, I felt that with Addie. It's interesting because I felt it with Shades of Magic, and then I felt like when I turned from Shades of Magic and Vicious to Addie LaRue, I was convinced that Addie was going to fail because it was so different from my other books. Like I didn't have an audience prep for this. I had a genre audience, and here I was going to come out with like literary, historical fiction with a tiny little genre element. And I was convinced the whole time I was writing it, I was like, nobody wants this from me. Nobody wants this. And then when Addie did well, I thought, shit, because like I like Addie, it's not like I can be like, well, don't worry guys, this is what I write from here on now. Like I don't have any more Addies. Like it was a one-time thing. And I look at all the books I have under contract for the next 10 years, they're all genre. And so then I had this wave of people being like, we want more of this. And it's like, too bad. Like I don't have any more of this. This took 10 years. So now I remember working on Gallant, the novel that comes out in March, and just being paralyzed because I knew it was going to be the book that followed Addie LaRue, and like, what am I supposed to do there? But I will say, I think it's the perfect book to follow Addie LaRue because it's also a standalone. It's also very lyrical. It's also told in third person present. It's totally different. It's like The Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak. Like it's very, very different and dark. But I think it has a lot of like the heart. Somebody I saw in a review recently said that it is quiet but not timid. Like it's a whispering book. And I think that maybe that hopefully it's the right book to follow Addie. Some days I think there is no right book to follow Addie. That's the problem. And I went through 6 months where I just thought to myself, like, maybe I don't write books anymore. Like maybe I just stop with Addie. So I think that's just to say like, yeah, it's probably one of those things I have to sit with every time I sit down to write, where like, I know with relative confidence that I will never write a book as successful as Addie LaRue in like a numbers way. I just don't think it's likely. So that means I can either be completely overwhelmed and quit, or I can accept that I need to change my definition of success to something else now. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is like, Addie has given me an incredible new readership who are just discovering me, many of them now going back and finding my other genre work. So hopefully I'll get some new lifelong fans out of that. But also like, it has given me the liberation to take risks and to try. And the thing is, like, I'm never going to write a book that everybody likes. Plenty of people hate Addie. And that's kind of liberating too, because, you know, it means I can just tell stories and hopefully the people that need them will find them.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we've talked a bit about Gallant, can you tell us anything about it? I'm so excited.
I mean, so it comes out in March. It is a standalone novel about a girl who cannot speak, who is living in an orphanage when she receives a letter inviting her home to a place she has never been. And a place that she has a journal from her mother. It's the only thing she has from her mother's. And the last page of the journal warns her never to go to this place. But she doesn't really have a choice. And so she ends up going to an estate called Gallant, where she finds the person who wrote the letter does not live there, like is dead. And everyone is behaving strangely. And there is a garden wall with a door in it that leads nowhere. And it is about what happens next. It is very strange and very dark, and it has illustrations. And I'm really, really, really proud of it. And everyone who's read it has like sobbed by the last page. So I'm like really, really hopeful.
Oh no, I see crying in my future. Okay.
Yeah.
At least I've been.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and how is just jumping around here? How is going back into the world of Threads of Power, into Shades of Magic? You know,
I mean, similarly neurotic, because now I'm afraid that I don't know how to write these books anymore because I'm 5 years older. I'm a different person. I think we forget that authors are constantly changing. So books become these static entities, and then we just continue to grow. But I'm learning to embrace it. I don't know. Everyone is convincing me, all of my team, my publicists and my agent and my editor, like just make the words. It's going to be okay. So I'm trying to trust them. I'm really excited with how it's coming together, but I'm also, of course, just incredibly daunted because it's a lot to live up to.
Yeah.
And I don't like to do the same thing twice. So I'm not looking to just make a Shades of Magic redux here.
Yeah, for sure. It must be difficult, but also, I don't know, like obviously I'm speaking from a fan perspective. It's so exciting.
I hope I don't disappoint you.
I'm sure you won't. And obviously Addie had such a journey, you know, throughout countries, but the Hungarian fans are just encountering her. So I was wondering if there's anything you'd like to say to those people who are picking up Addie for the first time.
I mean, I hope some part of the story speaks to you. It doesn't always have to be the part that speaks to somebody else, though. I think one of the things that excites me most about this book is that different people see different things at different times. So it's been a book where, like most of my novels, find their people, and those people are of the same generation, or they see the same message in it. Addie is the kind of story you will see something different depending on who you are and the life you've lived and the life you want to live. And that's really exciting to me. Some people see the book and feel nostalgic. Some people see the book and feel hopeful. Some people see themselves in Addie. Some people see themselves in Henry. I hope that everybody who reads it finds something of themselves in it.
Yeah, I do agree that that's what makes Addie so powerful, because when you wrote about time and how different choices will lead down different paths and you can never unchoose your path, I was like, well, you just summed up my 25 years on Earth.
Yep. And I felt that when I was 20 and in college, and when I was 25 and when I was 30, and I'm 34 now, and I'm sure I will continue to feel it. And I think like that's my hope then, is that like people come to Addie and they leave with something.
Yeah, I'm sure they will, and hopefully they will all love it as much as we did, because I've read it in English, and I know Fuji read it in English as well. So we're very excited about the Hungarian release, and congratulations! And we're also very excited about your other books.
I was gonna say, hopefully new readers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there will be. I know we've already talked multiple people into reading it.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for being book pushers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Oh my God. I was like, we literally couldn't believe that this was happening. So
No, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you both so much.